Just introduce ESGRREW to you, because there might be people here who haven't heard of this. So this is Sandy Lamel is at the back, Dr. Lamel, and I started this project up a few years ago, and it was part of the Future Earth, which Sarah is well aware of, research consortium. There were some, for the Earth Systems Governance Project, there were some task forces created to look at various concepts that we have to worry about when it comes to the global governance of environmental problems. And we came up with the idea of one that would look specifically at representations and rights of the environment. So what does the environment mean to people around the world, to different people, and how can we ensure that this is reflected in the international legal apparatus that is slowly evolving to animate global governance in these areas. Right? So, okay. So the idea behind the project then, I think, in terms of its mandate, is to create an open space for dialogue and reflection. We're very interested, of course, in an international perspective that includes Indigenous voices as well, right, which are so often neglected or deliberately avoided when it comes to the international dialogue. And a dialogue, of course, that reflects the diverse character of universities, organizations such as the United Nations and others. And then some of this is prompted by our desire, I suppose, to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals are not only achieved, but are also achieved fairly and equitably. And I think that's one of the main purposes of today. We want to talk about climate change, but we want to talk about it from different perspectives, technological, legal, cultural, and make sure that there's a fairness and inclusion in the dialogue. So we have, as indicates here, generating a process of intercultural and intersectoral dialogue, and these are some of the main inspirations from which we derive the work. The UNESCO Principles and Values on Diversity and Intercultural Dialogue, the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge, which came out of the World Commission, and the recommendations of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there are others, but these are three that we highlight. So we're interested in building bridges, finding new paths, articulating representations of the environment. Future Earth has a global reach. Thank you very much, Jill. Future Earth has a global reach in terms of a research consortium, but we're just as interested in working with UNESCO, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and other organizations. And we've been doing that to some extent already. In April, we had a meeting in Montreal where we more or less, in partnership with Montreal's Future Earth Hub, launched the ESGRREW process, and under patronage of UNESCO, which was very important, they helped out. We met at Concordia University, where I used to run the Loyola Center, Sustainability Research Center. It's been so long, I'm forgetting how to pronounce its name. Right? But we also met in Brussels last summer and had a very interesting dialogue there as well, and hope to continue it. And so this is the first event that we've held here. I should say, of course, that this is, thanks very much to Tom McMorrow, who's helped us add this to the much broader agenda of the Canadian Law and Society Association meeting. So this is viewed as part of that to some extent, but it stands as a separate event as well. So as I said, we are filming the presentations, so the hope is that we can get this up on the ESGRREW website. Perhaps it will also put it up on a UOIT website, and try to further dialogue in this manner. I'm hoping later we can have a bit of a workshop discussion where we discuss the new, relatively new, UNESCO Declaration of Principles on Climate Change, which is a very important document. UNESCO, as you might know, needs all the help it can get right now. Our American neighbors have decided to withdraw some funding from UNESCO. So I'm hoping the rest of the world, at least for now, will be strong and continue to support UNESCO's important mission of sharing scientific and cultural knowledge. So I'm very pleased that our president is here with us today. And this is, of course, Dr. Robert Bailey, who is interim president of UOIT. Robert comes originally, well, not originally, but at some point from Cape Breton University in Sydney, Nova Scotia, where he was provost and vice president academic. And his career as a senior academic leader includes serving as the inaugural director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Environment and Sustainability at Western University, which was, I think, an inspirational model for many of us that went on to create research centers and sustainability elsewhere. He was president of the Association of Canadian Universities for Northern Studies, received his PhD in zoology from Western, and completed his MSc in zoology at the University of Guelph, where I also did my undergrad, so we've got some commonalities. So if you'd like to come up and just say a couple of brief words of introduction. Thank you.
I will tell you, Peter mentioned that I was quite involved at Western in environmental studies and science and undergrad and grad programs there. I remember I volunteered, foolishly maybe, to teach a first-year environmental science course there that any student across campus could take, because I was really passionate about spreading that word. And the first lecture, this was, I think, early 2000s, where climate change did not have the pervasive, it wasn't pervasive in discussions or in intro environmental science courses, but I started the first lecture by trying to challenge the students about thoughts about environmental science and environmental studies. And I remember, and I think this is relevant today, maybe. I mean, I'm not arrogant enough to think I have elder wisdom. It's more like I'm a walking museum. But I talked to them about there is a view that one of the solutions to vexing environmental problems was salvation through technology, which I think maybe Dan will get into. And as we all know, that is a pervasive view, even almost 20 years later, that whatever problems face us, primarily discussions today are about climate change, that maybe there's a technological solution somehow that will enable us to sort of keep on keeping on with whatever we've been doing. So it was interesting to think back to that class. And the other thing, which again, maybe is a reflection of part of our discussion, the nature of our discussion today, but also the changing times to some extent, is I challenged the view that many people had at the time that most, if not all, environmental problems could be reduced to population size, population growth. And I think underneath that, I'd love to talk about that with people later. I think underneath that was actually a denial of voice in many cases of Indigenous people, other people. It was a weird kind of colonialism of environmental solutions. And I remember being horrified in talking to folks that were revered in environmental science at the time. We would have speakers come, and in conversations with graduate students, they would talk about restrictions on immigration and things like that, fear of importing in what they saw as different or lesser environmental values from other places. And I know that most, if not all of you, have read about, talked about this, but again, it was just, as I looked at what is going to be discussed in SABs, I kind of thought back to then and sort of a plus ça change, plus la même chose, and how far we've come at the same time. So anyway, really excited to be here. Welcome to those of you who have come from other places, and thank you for having me, for those of you who are usually here. Thanks.
And one of the themes in energy systems is this issue of wicked problem that Churchman introduced in 1967. We thought ozone depleting substance was going to be the first really tough challenge of a wicked problem, and we dodged that bullet. And I would argue that climate change is the wicked problem that humanity is going to face. And the wickedness, I never really thought about this until looking at geoengineering, it's the geoengineering aspect that is really the sort of the wickedness of it. And I never really heard much about geoengineering until more recently. And when you look at the numbers, it's coming. It's like a train on a track. And you can almost see where it's going to, I wrote the numbers here. 2026, human population is 8 billion. People are going to start, 8 billion, that actually is a lot of people. And I think we're going to hit 450 parts per million, which is that magic 2-degree climate change level. You heard it here first. I'm predicting 2033, 2034 is when we hit that. And that's not that far away. So any sort of energy systems that these guys have to build, try building a nuclear power plant or a large-scale dam. They're not going to be up and running by 2034 when we hit 450. And I wasn't sure whether, when Peter asked me to do this, whether to be an engineer. I don't really present as an engineer sometimes, I think, or a civil engineer or a systems engineer. But I wanted to stick the word civil in there. Because if you talk about climate change, if you talk about biodiversity these days, if you talk about almost anything, you need to talk about it through the lens of cities, I believe. 80%, at least 80% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to the people who live in cities. And cities got us into this mess, and it's going to be cities that get us out of this mess. And it isn't just climate change, it's biodiversity, it's land use changes. You can trace it all back to those with the money who tend to live in the cities. So I wanted to start this by introducing you to 3 engineers. So this guy here, John Smeaton, he is the rock star of engineers. So he's the first engineer ever to say, I don't want to be a military engineer. Up until 1770, all engineers were employed by the military, one way or another. Blowing something up, building a bridge to get an army here or there. And civil engineering was the second, actually. Military engineering was the first, civil was the second. And he wanted to be distinguished from military engineering, that he was doing something to help humanity. I'm not involved in wars. I am a civil engineer. And there's a plaque up for him, 1771. And his claim to fame is this is the Eddystone Lighthouse. This is the third one, because the first 2 crashed and burned, literally. And he was the first guy who came up with, basically dug all those rocks, or the stones that hold up the lighthouse. And this lighthouse actually ushered in, to a large extent, the Industrial Revolution. Up until then, ships kept crashing. It's off the coast of England. Huge, important guy. The second engineer that I wanted to introduce you to, because you probably haven't heard of this guy. Everybody's heard of Jon Snow, right? Not the Jon Snow, the dragon lover, but the other one, right? The one who basically figured out how to get rid of cholera. He was a medical doctor. Everybody loves him. He created, this is what he did. He created this is Bond Street Pump. And he ushered in epidemiology. He's the guy who basically, we're healthy because of Jon Snow. And another guy, Reverend Whitehead. And in the summer of 1845, cholera outbreak in London, lots of people dying and people complaining. The front page of the newspaper said, It's the Dam Water Authority, Water and Sewers, because they had dug up just down there this old site to put in a sewer, and there were people who had died from the plague who were buried there. And people were saying, well, that's why people get cholera, is because you did that. And so this guy, the second engineer, Edmund Cooper, was an engineer with the London Water and Sewer Authority, and he went and he mapped in meticulous detail every death and everything. And he he was able to prove that, hey, it wasn't our fault. That was dug up, but it was too far away from where all the people died, so stop blaming the sewer authority. And that was the end of it, basically, for that engineer. But John Snow got his map, went back to all these neighborhoods, and redid his map in a way that normal people, could actually understand. Edmund Cooper just had way too much data, inability to communicate, really. The doctor and the Whitehead was the guy who went with him. Reverend Whitehead, who went to all these houses, knew the neighborhood. He was a minister in the neighborhood. Had all these discussions, and lo and behold, they figured it out. All back to this Bond Street pump is where the source of the cholera was, and that was how they came up with the ghost map and solved cholera. Second engineer, Edmund Cooper, basically was there making excuses for the water authority, but his data and his information was the thing that John Snow used to cure, basically, cholera. Okay, the third engineer that I wanted to introduce you to is only a half engineer, really. So he's an economist, and economists, my background, economists always trump engineers. They basically pay the engineers to do. Anyway, this is the first person, the first engineer who ever used the concept of cost-benefit analysis. And he did it for a bridge for Napoleon. Napoleon said, should I build this bridge? What should I charge the toll? What should the toll be? And this guy did the work. And surprise, surprise, he suggested to Napoleon, go ahead, build the bridge. True engineering fashion, he did the cost benefit, kind of knowing that he was going to build this bridge anyways. But anyway, so that's the first time that we've used, as engineers, the concept of cost benefit analysis. Okay, the fourth person I wanted to introduce you to, actually, it's his sister I wish somehow is the fourth engineer that I could introduce you to. So this is, I found this on this picture on the internet. It's a year old, and just check out his T-shirt. I think it's a hand-me-down from Ontario, the Union Pearson Express. Anyways, so this guy's name, he's 13 years old now. It's a year old, so he's 14 years old. His name is Betu Candirno, and he lives in Beira, Mozambique. And he's been taken out of school, and his sister has been taken out of school as well because they can't afford the school fees, and he has to sell oranges to make money for the family. And he sells one orange every 2 hours. He makes 5 cents a day. So it's worth taking him out of school for 5 cents a day. And there are 400 million of Betus in the world today. So, and they're hugely important. And here's my argument why. So the data's a bit old, but it's still valid. So this is who caused climate change challenge. So we're the red, high-income countries, we're the red, part of the red pie on the right-hand side. 2 billion of us. And this is the flow, not the stock. If you did the stock, we'd look even worse, but forget that. And then we have China, India, 3 billion coming up on the orange. And then we have Betu and all of his compatriots. We have 3 billion people in the world contributing 2% of the emissions. And where do they all live? Here, Bangladesh, Tanzania, Mozambique, where Betu is. And in 10, 20, 30 years, when climate change starts to have much more of an impact, where there's another storm, another 10-year drought. I mean, Syria is the first big impact that we can see that we can really trace to climate change. But we're going to get a lot of them, especially the people living here. Now remember, Betu has really no education, but he's smart. So he kind of has one of two ways to go, right? If you're, put yourself in Betu's shoes 10 years, 20 years from now, what's he going to be when Mozambique has yet another problem? He's going to be angry. And you've got 400 million people here who have done nothing to cause the problem, who are being impacted much more than anyone else. And that is a recipe for fomenting terrorism and anger and angst and trouble. And that's the wickedness of climate change, I think. Okay, so let me just switch gears here. This is sort of systems engineering. This is our hero. This is the updated Rockstrom planetary boundaries by Stefan. And it's basically where are we out of whack in terms of planetary boundaries. You can see climate change, it's not even the worst one. Biodiversity is much bigger impact. We've got synthetic fertilizer, land use changes, lots of problems, right? And then you've seen these. These are sort of typical UN, World Bank kind of, you know, let's get everybody in a room. We started with 38. We whittled it down to 17. It's like, okay, good luck. But anyways, this is sort of the roadmap of sustainability, if you will. And that's really important. But I think it's also, well, let me just move ahead. So these sustainable development goals are really important. I don't want to diminish them in any way, but they're created by a bunch of World Bank types, country types. Countries represent, countries don't do. And I want to try and prove that to you. Back to this civil engineering thing. Okay, so really the impact on the planet is from people who live in cities. So I think that you really have to be able to get the sustainable development goals down to at least a city level. And a city for Toronto would include Oshawa, and you know, it's our transportation emissions, etc. But you kind of have to get it down to a city. And so we've done this with biophysical, social sciences, and to a large extent, cities, the world started with basically cities in charge. Cities were the ones who did all the trading. We had the Hanseatic League, Scandinavia, Germany, and then countries took over. So when the UN was created, initially, only back in 1946, it started with 45 countries. Today there's 200 countries in the world. I mean, countries are, but all of these cities have been there for more than 300 years. All of these cities are going to outlast their countries. And it's the city of Toronto and Montreal that drives Canada's economy. And the cities are getting more and more agitated. And I think it's this geoengineering that's going to cause the challenges. So what we did was we looked at this for Toronto. And so remember that slide with how unequal greenhouse gas emissions are allocated. So the first academic paper I ever wrote was at the World Bank, and nobody writes academic papers at the World Bank. Nobody reads academic, sorry. So anyways, I wrote this paper, and was with an intern from U of T, and she said, oh, well, let's publish it. We published it in Environment and Urbanization. And it went out, and nothing really happened. You know, it was a lot of work. Man, these papers are a lot of work. But it was published, and but it was with IIED, Environment and Urbanization, and they had a press release that went out with this paper that we didn't know about. And I was at the World Bank, and I got called into the vice president's office, and they said, what the hell did you do? And in that, we used data from Nature Climate, and we had numbers for the per capita greenhouse gas emissions of Cape Town. Well, they were wrong from the paper that it was. Anyways, so Cape Town, I learned the term, above the fold in a newspaper, means the top part, the part that everyone reads. There was, because of this paper where we had made a mistake, there was this thing in Cape Town, South Africa, that said, Cape Town's per capita greenhouse gas emissions higher than London. Shame on Cape Town. The shame on Cape Town was in smaller letters, fortunately. Anyway, so South Africa is a member of the World Bank. I got called in. I said, you know, you're not supposed to, what are you doing? And I kind of explained. And thank God the data we used was from a good journal, right? So I thought that was the end of it. So I just recently got married to a lovely woman who was here in Toronto who was the vice president for OPG. Her most important clients are the mayors of Pickering, where there's a Whitby, Oshawa, Clarington. Anyways, there was also in this paper that we wrote the schematic of 3 places in Toronto. One was Whitby, one was East York, and one was Etobicoke. And we, because we used data from Chris Kennedy at University of Toronto, we showed in that drawing that the per capita household greenhouse gas emissions of somebody in Whitby were 10 times greater than somebody in East York. Perfect data. I mean, there was nothing wrong with our data, but it was the front page of the Toronto Star. And the mayors called my wife, and I learned very quickly that if you want to change the world, the place to do it is cities. And it's with mayors, and it's with councillors, and it's with, because they read this stuff, and they phone, and they'll figure it out. And if 80% of our emissions are driving around cities, this is the place to make the difference, to a large, one of the most effective. Anyway, so we tried to look at this for Toronto. Same sort of thing. And this gets us to geoengineering. And why I think cities are the where a lot of the rubber's going to hit the road on this. So if you do a cost-benefit analysis, like a real one, not like one for Napoleon, but the benefits are almost impossible to measure now when you look at the city's benefits versus the country's benefits versus the region's benefits. And this is going to be really amplified for geoengineering. So, and part of the problem with geoengineering is we don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what the benefits are going to be. We know pretty well what the costs to implement it are, but we don't know what the externality impact costs are. And so there's solar radiation management, and that's basically we put some sulfur, we try and change the albedo of the planet, and it's staggeringly cheap to do this. You can start screwing around with the world's atmosphere at roughly 50 cents a ton is what the cost is. Whereas carbon dioxide removal and mitigation is somewhere around $150 to $200 a ton. So now, I love the point, Deborah's point about it's not the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change going and saying, well, but now we have a cap and trade. Well, so we've introduced a cap and trade. The World Bank was very instrumental in putting a price on carbon. Well, if you have a price on carbon and it costs you $200 a ton to remove that carbon, but it costs you 50 cents a ton to start screwing around with the planet's atmosphere, you can almost see where we're headed, right? I don't know how many of you remember in 2012, there was a guy, and it's just, the odds of him being named Disney is just amazing. There was a guy named Mr. Disney who took a barge, off of British Columbia and put 100 tons of iron filings, basically, into the ocean. He said, I'm doing this because what's going to happen is there'll be this great big algae bloom and then all of the salmon will eat more. It was off of Haida Gwaii. He said, oh, no, I'm doing this because I care about the environment, blah, blah. This was the first, pretty well the first experiment of geoengineering at a pretty large scale. He had a ship and he dumped all of the iron filings off. And he had, lo and behold, it worked. He had this great big algae bloom. And he was saying, oh, I'm doing this because I can raise money on the Clean Development Mechanism, this thing the World Bank created to try and reduce carbon in the atmosphere. And you couldn't fault the guy for his logic. He got charged. 2 years later, he was charged, and his life has not turned out very nicely after that. But the point is that that was the first time. Some guy in a boat So remember Betu, right? Now Betu, or whether it's, I don't know, anybody basically can say, wow, climate change is really bad. I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to try and change algae blooms, or I'm gonna shoot rockets with sulfur up into the atmosphere to change the climate. And they can do it. And we do not have, we're in a moral hazard. This is a classic example of an engineer's moral hazard where we do not have the moral right as Canada or as Toronto to say to Betu or to say to the guy in the boat with the iron filings, you cannot do that. We're going to have to stop them by force, and that is a whole mess, but that's where we're headed. Or you have this whole free rider, and that's where the problem is with the carbon dioxide removal. Everybody's a free rider there because we're all, I mean, Canada, we've missed our Kyoto target, we missed our Copenhagen target. We now have a target that we signed on to in Paris where, well, you heard it here first, but there is no way we're going to make that target. And we all know it. But nobody, it's so far out into the future, we're pretending that, oh, somehow we'll magically get to that one. Everybody is a free rider on climate change. And I don't, and geoengineering is basically the chicken, playing chicken in the car, who's going to grab the steering wheel first, is the playing chicken that can somehow force us to address this free rider. We're in uncharted territory when it comes to risk management tools. I'm the Chief Safety and Risk Officer for Ontario, which nobody knows, nobody reads my reports, fortunately, because nothing's blown up while I've been there. But I write this thing every year, touch wood, every year on what is the risk, the greatest risks that Ontario faces. And I just steal the annual risk from the World Economic Forum and then apply it to Ontario. And it's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, there's cybersecurity, there's climate, there's a bunch of things. But we do not know, really, how to measure the risk for geoengineering. I do not know, as an engineer or as a risk expert, how to quantify that risk. Because it can happen very fast. It could be another bonehead in a boat off of, I don't know, off of Nova Scotia this time, dumping iron in the ocean. It's so difficult to measure. Also, if you don't like nuclear power, you're really going to hate geoengineering. Because it is one of those things that it's almost impossible to quantify the risk. The actions are totally dependent on the whole militaristic backing of the decisions. Or you have somebody who just decides to do it like the guy in the boat. It took 3 years for the government of Canada to charge this guy. And they didn't know how to charge. They didn't know what to charge him with originally. And the thing, though, I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic with the students. I can prove it. And I think geoengineering is a thing that's going to force us to work together, to create these new teams, integrated teams, Indigenous, perspective, engineering, risk management, communication, how do you bring people on side, these sorts of things, metrics, how do you measure, allocation of risk, we're going to have to figure out whole new ways of insurance premiums, all these sorts of things, and we're going to have to figure out a different way of looking at the jurisdictions. We cannot let countries negotiate a geoengineering agreement because the countries do not represent sufficiently well enough cities, for example.
I think I understand some of what you mean by geoengineering from how you've been using it, but can you define it
Sure.
for us?
I can try. I don't, yeah. So there's two types of geoengineering, really. There's SRM, solar radiation management, and that's basically trying to do things to change the albedo of the planet, to make it less dark, more white. It's things like sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. They've been talking about dumping white plastic balls in the ocean to make them more reflective. Lots of relatively easy, call them easy things. there's people who argue that we're doing it now by putting sulfur in jet fuel and trying to seed the. If you make more clouds, you can change. You can have the more light is reflected off of the clouds. So that's the one that has everybody scared, rightly so, because you can do it pretty cheaply. We've had a couple examples of solar radiation. Is the last few big volcanic eruptions. Enough, sulfur dioxide up in the atmosphere, it reflects the sunlight. So it's basically man-made volcanoes is probably the easiest way, plus maybe changing the albedo. And then CDR is carbon dioxide removal, which is, maybe you heard about the big, this thing that was going to work in Saskatchewan. It's not working so well, where you would take the carbon dioxide out of flue gases, pump them underground, or some sort of mitigation measure of basically taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There's two types. Does that make sense, more or less? The solar radiation management is much easier. You just throw the stuff up in the air, or iron filings is an SRM because of the algae bloom. And carbon dioxide removal, the going rate is about $150 a ton. Now remember that the province of Ontario has signaled that the price of carbon is $100 a ton in 2022. So we're headed up pretty quickly to high costs of carbon. So we have two different types of changing the amount of carbon dioxide or changing the impact of climate, climate change. And then the last point I wanted to make was that we also have this thing that will be happening over the next 20 years, I think, where Toronto especially, and maybe Toronto and Montreal, will start to emerge as probably not a good term, sanctuary city, but as cities, of all of the 100 largest cities in the world, Toronto is probably the one, and this is GTHA, is the one that is probably poised to be the most resilient, able to be the most resilient and most adaptive. The only one that comes close is Chicago, larger cities. And that's because we're next to the Great Lakes, which are going to be around for another 100 years. They're going to be impacted severely, but we'll have water, we have food, we're not coastal. A good 50% of the big coastal city or big cities in the world are coastal, and they're going to have all sorts of problems. There's already in place a plan that nobody talks about, but it's strategic retreat of the stock exchange from New York to Chicago. I don't think it will happen, but that's the sort of scale. Miami, for example, don't buy real estate in Miami. You heard it here first. But Toronto and Montreal, and this is a different sort of flavor of what's good for Toronto may not necessarily be good for Timmins or especially not good for Edmonton and Calgary. So we have this challenge emerging between the politics and the pragmatism. And so the science of geoengineering it's pretty complicated, but it is rocket science, I guess. But it's doable, right? But I think it's how we embrace the technology. I mean, one of the points I make in energy systems is that the technology is the easy part, really. It's the social license, and it's how society responds and gives you, whether they give you the social license or not, is what makes all the difference. And this will be I think, the challenge that we face for geoengineering. And hopefully we don't have to get to there, but every day it's almost like you can see society is being painted into a corner.
So my plan for just the next 20 minutes or so, or however long I'm granted, is to grapple with this big idea of transformation. It's a word we hear more and more and more in the scholarship around sustainability, around environmental issues, as though everybody's getting impatient, rightly so. We're not meeting targets we're setting. We're seeing that there's a lot of progress to be made and sort of accelerating challenges. both from an ecological and a human standpoint. But what transformation actually means, who participates in it, who benefits from it, who triggers it, shapes it, envisions it. These are kind of all of these questions that are coming up as we start to talk about the idea of transformation or sustainability transformation. So I'm just going to throw a couple of those questions at you today and perhaps spark some conversation about this transformation ideally to a more sustainable, more just, equitable future. I consider myself an urban climate change governance scholar largely, so I do focus on at the urban scale, and I often take a governance lens. But for me, it's really important to weave the technical together with the social and the political and consider that holistic system because we keep on coming up with cool widgets and technologies and and then they languish in some cases, or they're misapplied in others. So it's really the challenge of our political systems and our behaviors and social norms that I think are the really tough nut to crack when we're grappling with transitioning to a sustainable future. I like this too, for totally different reasons, because it shows it highlights all the stuff that's not here. So this is indeed the planetary boundaries idea has been swiftly kind of taken up by the global sustainability community as a data-based illustration of all of the planetary level systems that we are experimenting with. So we are geoengineering, whether or not we are choosing to or know that we are, right? So we are in the midst of a massive planetary scale experiment. We don't know what the outcomes are, and that's a bit unsettling. So, here we see all these 9 systems, 4 of which Will Steffen and Johan Rockström and others would argue we've pushed past this threshold for launching ourselves into this new territory where the future is wildly uncertain and the impacts of those changes are planetary in scope. But I mean, I immediately look at this and I go, yes, but where are the people? There are people in this natural system, in this set of natural systems, and extricating humans from the planetary systems in such an artificial way, to me, is challenging. So there are other ways of kind of talking about this path that we, and I say we in sort of a grand sense, but have collectively set ourselves on. Some are called, that the Anthropocene language is very is popular now. Others talk about the great acceleration. All of these indicators or all of these trajectories that we find ourselves pushing along, the accelerated exponential increase. So we're not following this gentle linear path, but rather an exponential increase in water use, paper production, fertilizer consumption, energy use, world population that mirrors a series of Earth system trends as well. There used to be one, I think in an early draft of this, there used to be number of Big Macs eaten or something, like other sort of strangely obscure indicators of what humans are doing to themselves and the planet. But nonetheless, we sense, I think, intuitively that this is a time of accelerating change, and we see evidence of that both socially and ecologically. Climate change being one of the key manifestations of that. And often when I sort of talk to scholars and public groups and whatever, I show the nice little Keeling curve, and then I show carbon dioxide going up, the concentration of carbon dioxide going up, since we've been measuring it for the last 50 or 60 years, and then zoom out a few hundred years, zoom out 10,000 years, the entirety really of or the recent human civilization, back 800,000 years, and it's still this shocking exponential increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is new territory in some ways, and familiar territory in others. So there's some interesting challenges to grapple with there. So scholars from systems thinking, from socio-ecological systems, from sustainability transitions, et cetera, are sort of coming up with ways to frame what a transformation is. How is it different from incremental action, from steps down a particular path? What are we either trying to avoid, or what are we aiming for that is radically different from before? And this, the way that this definition is kind of gelling, to me, points to the idea of how important the social dimensions are over the technical ones. And that is that a transformation, according to folks like Mark Pelling or Karen O'Brien or others, is this fundamental, exponential, or nonlinear change in the way a whole system functions. So the time frame is unclear. We don't know really how fast these transformations occur, but we know that it's an alteration to the underlying function of a system. But more than that, the sociological system as we know it, doesn't just perform differently. The underlying logic, the values that underpin it, are actually shifting, and that's the tougher stuff. It's like, it's what we think cities should do. It's what we think our economy, who we think our economy should serve. Those kinds of underlying questions about values and function of our sociopolitical and sociological systems are what we're actually talking about when we speak about transformations. The challenge is conceiving of governing a desirable transformation, one that we want. And I want to tease apart that we, because surely there is a great variety of perspectives about what might a desirable transformation look like. That may vary from rural to urban. That may vary from country to country. That may vary from neighborhood to neighborhood within a city. Certainly there are multiple perspectives on what a good future might look like. And we have thus far been very, very bad at designing governance processes that account for those multiple visions and that meaningfully include different voices about the future. But if we acknowledge that transformation is this process of intentionally or otherwise restructuring the purpose and function of our socioecological or sociopolitical systems, then what we actually need to talk about when we're grappling with what to do about climate change is the root causes of risk, the root causes of high emissions pathways, right? And those are often one and the same. And some would say our current model of capitalism, for instance, is one of those root causes of both vulnerable communities and risks related to climate change impacts, as well as fundamentally high emissions trajectories. And so then that would lead you to conclude then that a technology won't get at those underlying drivers of risk and mitigation alone. It's the values that led to the development and adoption of that technology that's the deeper cause of both risk and high emissions pathways. So these tougher issues, gender inequalities, distribution of wealth, definition of the good life, these are all sort of those core root causes of vulnerability, in my perspective. Who participates in experiments in transformation, in sustainability transformations in particular? So I'm shifting my focus now to like, let's say that there's a future out there that we actually want to engender, that we want to cultivate. Who gets to participate in designing that future? Typically, on the climate change front, the path forward has been negotiated through massive international state-to-state negotiations, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, international law, that obviously privilege particular voices over others. Of course, international treaties are all well and good, but of course, you all with law backgrounds know better than I that they have to become manifest in domestic law and implemented somewhere else other than the international level. So they have to take root somewhere else. And so so in order to do so, a series of groups and voices in my view, need to be incorporated into designing those or having a conversation about those transformation experiments. I focus on a couple of these personally more than others, only because of bandwidth issues, not because of desire. But increasingly, our notion of governance is becoming much more expansive, at least in the scholarship, right? That moving from an idea of government to governance to a process of formal and informal mechanisms, all different actors, including the private sector. I do a lot of work on small businesses increasingly for a lot of reasons I can talk about later if we have time. And I'll give a couple of slides of some recent data that we've been collecting on small businesses. But networks among communities, city to city, partnerships, partnerships among indigenous communities around the world, gender-based groups and networks are having are some of the more traditionally neglected yet incredibly important voices on transformation experiments. Civil society groups, marginalized or silenced groups, perspectives that embody a different way of knowing, both knowing climate and knowing the pathways towards sustainability and knowing what a functional community might look like, different ways of learning and cultivating change. So these are sort of the non-traditional actors in the governance of climate change and sustainability transitions that, in my view, really add an incredible amount of richness and, in fact, are indispensable when we start to come up with ideas about how the future might look. As I mentioned, I increasingly focus on small businesses, and there's sort of a random reason why this is that I finished my PhD and I started working for a social enterprise that trained other small businesses to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But I was working a lot on climate change, municipal climate change policy, and I thought, this is so interesting. Small businesses are kind of like an analog for cities. You know, that nation to nation, there's been a lot of negotiations, but cities were largely absent from that initially because there's just hundreds and thousands of them, and individually they don't have much in the way of power. That's changed over time. The voice of cities has become a lot stronger in international negotiations. Similarly, large transnational corporations hold an incredible amount of sway, but the majority of Canadians in the private sector actually work in small businesses, and about 60% of Canadian greenhouse gas emissions are produced by small businesses. But coordinating them is really challenging. These are businesses with 3 and 5 and 20 people with little bandwidth for change in some cases. In other cases, radical notions about how to reformulate the interaction between business and society through social enterprise, benefit corps, that kind of thing. So I became interested in the ways in which entrepreneurs at all levels have some particular qualities that might actually make them a really interesting source of inspiration or source of innovation on sustainability transitions. We view them as pretty agile and often able to sort of read the landscape of changing sort of demand and changing sociopolitical conditions and find an opportunity that you or I might not see. Not presuming that none of you are entrepreneurs, of course. Many of you might be. Willing to take risks, perhaps, that others are not, and take advantage of opportunities. But these are not, I'm not trying to ascribe to sort of the great man notion of an entrepreneur, that it's this exceptional character completely detached from their community, but rather these are individuals that are deeply embedded in their communities and of their culture. And of course, I think by including more sort of small business voices, we actually get a better swath of different societal groups sort of participating in the conversation around sustainability as well. The challenge is that they have all these different motivations behind the business that they do. There's very few mechanisms for coordinating them to sort of enhance or accelerate experiments that they might be undertaking on sustainability in communities. And individually, their emissions are quite low. So you get Walmart to change something on their emissions profile, and it's very much like a whole country did it in terms of scale. A small business less so. But we also see small businesses undertaking vastly more ambitious sustainability experiments that you might see in their large corporate counterparts. Like they'll reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 30% in a year and a half or something, because they're quite nimble and they can do that. So there's a lot of potential there. Just to sort of further that argument, we, my students and I, we have a lab called the Sprout Lab, the Sustainability Policy on Urban Transformation Lab. Took me a while to come up with that acronym. We sent out a survey to small businesses in Toronto and Vancouver, which, for any of you who have done large-scale survey research, I don't know why I did it, but I thought it might be interesting, and I wanted to get perspectives from more than just the 5 or 6 leading, you know, entrepreneurs or small businesses that do cool things. So we launched this massive survey, and it was an electronic survey, and so every morning I'd wake up and I'd be accused of breaking Canada's anti-spam legislation by somebody. And then there would be like a formal letter to my ethics board, and I'd have to respond, justifying the fact that I was not, in fact, breaking Canada's anti-spam legislation. So this was super fun. And yet, we got 1,700 responses, which is pretty good. And we're learning a lot about the way that small businesses think about sustainability and are motivated to innovate on sustainability. And the trauma is now fading, so I can actually like process the data. And as part of what we found that I just want to highlight that makes my point, again, that this is not so much sustainability isn't so much a technical or a rational assessment of cost benefits kind of challenge, even for business. That number one in the benefits that our small businesses saw was actually related to making progress on sustainability, was improving their reputation in the community. So cutting their costs was number 2, and that's usually what we think of when we try and cultivate sustainability innovations in small businesses. It is important, but even more important than or equally at least, to cutting costs was their reputation. So they see themselves as leaders or as embedded in their communities, and it's important to maintain legitimacy and credibility in the eyes of both their suppliers, their customers, and the broader community. So we are starting to frame small businesses as social actors, not simply these rational utility maximizing robots. And this is not shocking news if you're a behavioral economist or an ecological economist or whatever. But we have some evidence to support that for small businesses. Similarly, small businesses view themselves as having impact beyond their own kind of mechanistic operations. That they are trying to influence the habits of their users and customers, obviously. But this is a really kind of interesting one. It's the lowest of the 4, but 27% of our small businesses, fully a quarter, say that they see themselves as trying to influence policy or regulation, which is interesting because they're tiny, most of them. They are limited in the pathways they have for lobbying or for influencing regulation in some way. But there are ripple effects from their activities that they view as being sort of core to their logic. So we try to think of, because I'm not a real business scholar, which I enjoy, if I were in a business school, I'd probably be looking more internal to the SME's own operations. But we try and place the small business in this sort of multi-level governance framework. They are one actor, one part of a sustainability or socio-technical system, and understanding the ripple effects of their actions gets us to a better understanding of what it means to transform an urban space towards sustainability. So if we acknowledge then that we've gotten ourselves into quite a pickle with regard to various sustainability dimensions, and a transformation, i.e., a radical rethinking of the underlying values and function of our socio-ecological system is necessary, how do we get there? And there are a few ways of thinking about this. Just scaling up technical stuff, And this is what you most commonly hear about. We have this really cool district energy system. How do we do it everywhere else? Or, you know, we have some solar panels. How do we do it everywhere else? Without any thought to how artificial it is to rip something up from one place and try and plant it in another place and have it succeed. We also have interventions that occur when we've tried incremental stuff a lot, and now we're kind of at the limits of that, and we have to go into sort of whole new territory. But what I'm most interested in is this last notion, which I sort of introduced earlier, that in fact, one of the most powerful pathways to transformation is getting at the root causes of unsustainability at the beginning. So addressing development deficiencies. And in a very concrete, sort of concrete, I needed better analogy, in the natural equivalent of concrete way, we think about linking adaptation and mitigation together through a lens of sustainability in urban spaces. And I can give you very practical examples of what this might look like. So traditionally, we think about, and I say traditionally in the way that cities are governed, we have adaptation over here, and that's responding to the impacts of climate change. And we do things like design flood responses and emergency responses, and we try to plan land use so that communities aren't flooded and such. We do infrastructure, critical infrastructure protection, and open space preservation. And you see this community of scholarship around adaptation coming out of a particular disciplinary sort of origin as well, often related to development studies and ecology and this kind of thing. And then over here we have mitigation. We have our engineers and our economists, people focusing on renewable energy, sustainable transport, industrial processes, carbon capture and storage. Never the two shall meet, which is very strange, given the way that systems are, cities are actually planned, the way nature actually functions, and also perhaps given the way we think about the future, which surely those two are enmeshed in all kinds of ways. So increasingly, cities are trying to think creatively about strategies that do both at the same time, that give us adaptation benefits and give us mitigation benefits, and potentially address some of these underlying causes of both vulnerability and high emissions pathways. And that's where the synergies between adaptation and mitigation come in. There are some strategies that fall within this category, like green infrastructure, so using nature to do things that we did that typically we've done over the last several decades with metal and concrete and glass. So can we use a wetland to purify water, of course, and cushion cities from flood impacts while creating recreational opportunities and aesthetic benefits and public health benefits all at the same time as sinking carbon and protecting against floods. So ecosystem-based approaches and green infrastructure are really promising sources of experiments on transformation towards more sustainable communities. Water and energy conservation, afforestation, which of course creates shade and cooling and also sinks carbon and does all these other good things. But some of the more fundamental ones, like addressing income distribution issues, poverty, thinking about values shifts, those values that honor consumption, for instance, or status related to consumption, community isolation, these kinds of things are actually more likely to deliver benefits on both fronts and perhaps get at those root causes of unsustainability than this artificial distinction between adaptation and mitigation. You might say then, goodness me, those would probably be governed very differently from these strategies that are nicely hived off into silos, right? And it's true that a different model of governance is required to cultivate those responses in the middle than on either side necessarily. And the way we sort of think about that is that there's all kinds of qualities of that governance, of sustainability governance, that we might seek to cultivate, like inclusivity, flexibility, the ability to learn from mistakes, an appetite for failure, for acknowledging that experiments not all of them will succeed, and that's okay, and that's how you learn. A politician would tell me, yes, well, that's nice because you have tenure. You're like unfireable. I will get fired in 3 years or whatever if I have a whole series of, yay, failed experiments that I can learn from. So I acknowledge that that's a privileged position I speak from. But nonetheless, there's a lot to learn from these experiments that go awry. And we are, in my view, heading into a very deeply uncertain future, as if the last year hasn't given us incredible evidence of that, south of the border at least. And in fact, we don't just not know how much and how fast and in what way climate is going to change. We know some of that. We also actually don't even know the values of future people, right? We don't know how the pathway we've chosen will be evaluated by future people. And that is a level of uncertainty, radical uncertainty or indeterminacy, that makes it very, very difficult to try and steer or manage a transition towards some sustainable future in this highly sort of mechanistic way. Accelerating the process towards a sustainable future, if we have created visions of the future that have nuance, that are holistic, and that are representative of the values of the people to which those visions pertain. I would just throw a couple of ideas at you before I wrap up, which is we as scholars, I take responsibility for this as well, that our whole way of knowing, our whole way of understanding the world tends to be that humans are like little pots to be filled with knowledge. You know, you fill them up full of data, and then they make different decisions. Clearly, that's not actually how people make decisions at all. And we have decades of learning from, you know, social psychology and all kinds of stuff, saying that the deficit model is an inadequate representation of how people make decisions. But this science comprehension thesis, and I am all for science literacy and climate literacy. I taught a MOOC called Climate Literacy. Speaking of trauma, 15,000 students or whatever doing mob dynamics on a massive open online course about climate change. But this hope that we can build better scientific literacy and then better social and political decisions will result. We have evidence to suggest that that's not so true. The contrary sort of thesis, the cultural cognition thesis, we interpret what we learn according to the values of the group with which we identify, seems to be much more accurate. So that means then that there are many different sets of values out of which we all grow and through which we process new information. So as an example, if you have a strong, you know, liberal over here and a super strong conservative over here, and you give them the same information, they won't go like this. They'll actually get better at arguing why they should be here. And this is why climate change can be such a polarizing issue, that it actually gives people ammunition to better argue the position they held before getting that information, which is interesting. So we use reason not so much to improve knowledge and make better decisions, but to make our arguments to persuade others and ourselves that our instincts are right. We like to feel right. And so we use information to do that. So if we took this seriously and we changed the way we educate, or we changed the way we have conversations about sustainability transitions in urban spaces based on this, what would that look like? Well, this is all messy territory, but a few ideas instead of hammering away with more data, more objective evidence. And we also know, instead of hammering away with the doom and gloom story, which we know it disempowers and freezes people up because it's this existential threat that no one individual can possibly grapple with, what else can we do? And there are different perspectives on what else we can do. And they sort of fall into this kind of nudge framework or set of ideas, the engagement-oriented stream, and the sort of reward or incentives. So we know that forced compliance with any set of environmental regulations, goals, whatever, is insanely onerous and expensive, and also doesn't deal with those root causes. Indirect suggestions, however, incentives, more inclusive narrative-based conversations, storytelling, visualizations, etc., can actually be more effective. There's a couple of really, pragmatic examples. I actually got my natural gas bill the other day from Union Gas, and it told me how high my consumption was relative to my neighbors. And I had been using this example for a while, but I hadn't gotten my own, so I didn't know what my own comparison in natural gas consumption was. And it told me that I was 3 times higher than my neighbors. I was consuming 300% of what my neighbors were consuming on natural gas. And then I had this little Ukrainian Christmas party a couple weeks ago. My neighbors came over, and one of them said, "You know what, I got my Union Gas bill, and I'm using 3 times what my neighbors are using." And I was like, "Hey, I'm using 3 times what my neighbors are using." So I don't actually know. Maybe my gas provider is just telling everybody that we're using. Because it was really effective. I got a new boiler. Partly because my 30-year-old one died. But anyway, I actually felt for myself this interesting social comparison between me and the people around me that was, even for me, and I do this on a daily basis, like this is actually my job, affected my own motivation to change my individual behavior, which was interesting. I've also been part of a lot of participatory processes where we envision kind of community features and then actually visualize them using 3D kind of visualization technologies to see what a neighborhood might look like into the future, 2020, 2050, 2100. Because we know that humans react to stories, of course, and pictures and art much more powerfully than they do to data and graphs and such. And so to actually internalize all the complexity of a transition towards a sustainable future, those kinds of tools are really crucial. And we just simply must go beyond this kind of reductionist deficit model of how people learn. So I would leave you with this image of Kingsway Corridor in Burnaby, BC. This is not what most of us picture when we picture Vancouver or the west coast of British Columbia, but this is typical of a lot of Canadian cities, right? You know, we have so much space, we don't even know what to do with it. So we sprawl out and we make communities based around the car that are really, really easy to drive on and not do much else. Not a lovely place to walk. I don't even know where I'd be walking to aside from getting a used car or whatever in this neighborhood. Not much, I mean, obviously impermeable surfaces, not much in the way of shade cover, all kinds of stuff going on here that's unsustainable and totally characteristic of Canadian cities. I'm from Manitoba, originally Brandon, Manitoba, so this is exactly what Brandon and kind of Waterloo looks like. Oshawa, actually, from the little bit that I saw of it on the way in. But there are a whole slew of visions of transformation for cities like this that are interesting and dangerous because they always make manifest a particular set of values and exclude others. And they always constrain our imaginations. Once we see one particular set of options, it's really hard to imagine other options. But nonetheless, this is one way this could look. Kingsway Corridor. Not everybody wants to live in a city like this, obviously. But there's a whole bunch of things going on here. This is mixed, compact mixed use. This is kind of the urban standard where we have residences above businesses. There's actually no car lanes left, so it's only mass transit and cycling, at least in this neighborhood, which is kind of interesting. We have, solar power production. We have perhaps a local market, more active transportation, so there's public health benefits, permeable surfaces and shade cover, green walls and roofs. We still have Quiznos. Do you have Quiznos in Oshawa? I don't know why Quiznos survived, but it totally did. So all kinds of sustainable solutions going on in one community. But I use this in part to stress that this can be the imposition of a dominant set of ideas about what a city should look on the people who live in this community. This may not be desirable to everyone, and it may not be what we consider desirable 50 or 80 years from now. But nonetheless, being imaginative, thinking about radically different ways to live in cities can help to question those root causes of both vulnerability and high emissions pathways, in my view.